Hey guys, Cade here. 2017 was one of our best years for Cartoon Conspiracy here on Channel Frederator. So here are a few of our favorite conspiracies. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so that you can be informed when we upload our videos.
So I'm not sure if you noticed, but we recently passed a pretty momentous day in the history of cartoons. I know, the year is moving so fast we sometimes forget about these milestones of remembrance. Yes, it was in fact just a couple of short weeks ago, on March 6th of 2017, that Squidward Tentacles accidentally froze himself for 2,000 years in the freezer of the Krusty Krab. Okay, so maybe I overplayed the intro just a little bit. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm describing the events of the Season 1 episode of SpongeBob SquarePants SB-129, where exactly what I just described happens. Squidward accidentally freezes himself for 2,000 years, he messes around with a time machine, and hilarity ensues. But with all the internet discussion and memes about this episode that popped up around the 6th of March this year, and it was mostly memes, I'm not gonna lie to you, I got to thinking, nature is really weird, and there are some really tough animals out there that can survive practically anything. With that in mind, could a creature like Squidward actually survive being frozen for an extended period of time and then reanimated like we see in the episode? So the way this show usually works is we take a popular fan theory and then take a look at clues in the show to see how well they hold up. But this time, we're gonna do things a little differently. This time, it's the show itself that's providing us with the theory to analyze. And we're going to examine this by diving into a big old ocean full of science. And we're going to start by taking a look at who else but Squidward the octopus himself. Yes, you heard right. Squidward the octopus, not the squid. If you're a longtime SpongeBob fan, this may be old news to you. But to the surprise of a lot of people, Squidward is not actually the same species as his namesake. This has been confirmed multiple times through interviews with SpongeBob creator Stephen Hillenburg, as well as by Squidward himself in episodes like The Play's the Thing or Patrick the Game. In retrospect, this makes a lot of sense, since Squidward bears a resemblance to an octopus rather than anything else. Well, except for the fact that he only has 6 tentacles. Hillenburg states that the choice to make Squidward a hextopus rather than an octopus was motivated mainly by the fact that 6 tentacles was easier to animate. It also made Squidward's general design a little less busy. Of course, now I have gripes with the naming conventions of everything in the show involving Squidward. Like in the episode Love That Squid, Squidward dates another octopus named Squilvia. What are the odds that 2 octopi are both going to have squid-based pun names? And furthermore, why is the title of the episode— got a little off track there, sorry. But the fact that Squidward is an octopus is an important distinction to make in this situation. While there may be a host of similarities between squids and octopi, seeing as they're both cephalopods, things can get a bit more complicated when we break them down further into different species of each, which could prove useful further down the line for our purposes today. As for the theory itself, this episode pretty much covers the specifics. I mean, ignoring all of the cartoon logic that happens in SpongeBob all the time, Squidward is frozen solid after locking himself in a freezer and remaining there for 2,000 years. And finally re-emerging and being thawed on March 6th of the year 4017. He's then able to function like nothing happened. Now obviously this sounds ridiculous, but there actually is a precedent for certain types of animals to withstand brutally cold conditions. One of the most impressive cases of surviving comes from the microanimal the tardigrade, also known as the water bear, which is a much cuter name, which are microscopic organisms that are known as the most resilient animals ever. Firstly, they've been known to survive in the vacuum of space. And secondly, they've also been known to be capable of withstanding temperatures as low as 1 Kelvin, which is about negative 458 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 272 degrees Celsius. Though that said, we're not talking about being completely frozen solid. I mean, at 1 Kelvin we should be, but tardigrades are tough. They can get through anything. Thankfully, there actually are some animals that have the amazing ability to essentially be frozen solid and then reanimated. Unfortunately, this ability hasn't been found in humans yet. However, certain species of frog, like the wood frog, other amphibians, and microscopic beings have been documented as being effectively frozen and then brought back to life, going on to live their lives without any acknowledgement of the brilliance of their black magic. So if this is possible with these animals, most of which are cold-blooded just like the octopus, is there any possibility that Squidward might have a similar ability, allowing himself to survive being frozen solid? So, ocean sciences are pretty crazy. I say this because despite all of the amazing technology and resources we have available to us today, we know so little about our own oceans. And that's not a slight at the world's oceanographers or marine biologists or other ocean scientists, which clearly I'm not one of. We know so little about them because of how massive they are. I mean, yes, the ocean covers about 70% of the Earth, but it's easy to forget that the ocean isn't just the surface. It's also incredibly deep. I'm talking like 14-year-old Jacob sitting in his room wearing all black writing edgy poetry deep. The average depth of the ocean is about 3.7 kilometers deep, or about 2.1 miles. But the deepest part of the ocean, the Challenger Deep located in the Marianas Trench, that is about 11 kilometers or 6.8 miles deep. And just for reference here, Mount Everest is only about 5.5 miles tall. If it sat at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, it wouldn't even come close to breaching the surface of the water. So with that in mind, is it really that surprising to hear that we might know less about our own oceans than things like our solar system? 12 humans have been to the moon. Only 3 have been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. And about 95% of our oceans remain completely unexplored. So other than sharing all of these incredibly cool and sobering stats with you, why am I telling you all of this? Because the ocean is terrifying and you should be terrified too. The Kraken, Cthulhu, still distinct possibilities. Maybe. But I'm also telling you this because discoveries are being made all the time about the weird, amazing stuff that lurks below us. And I'm not a marine biologist, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Because there may be new discoveries popping up someday that change the nature of this episode. So let's start with some basic stuff about the octopus. The average lifespan of an octopus is between 3 and 5 years. So obviously there's no chance of Squidward living 2,000 years on his own, but is freezing himself really the best option here? Well, first, what kind of octopus is Squidward? Based on some observations, we can make a pretty educated guess. If we take a look at Squidward's habitat, we can assume that he's what's called a common octopus, which, unsurprisingly, is the most common species in the world. They generally live on the sea floor and not usually more than 200 meters away from the surface in tropical areas. All of this information checks out in the show. The general setting of Bikini Bottom tells us that we are indeed in a tropical environment. And we can definitively tell that Squidward lives close to the surface because the show isn't, pitch black. As light hits the ocean, the first 100 meters below are generally pretty well illuminated. But as we travel deeper, sunlight has a much harder time getting through, as by that point it's already mostly dispersed. And once we're about a kilometer deep, absolutely no sunlight makes its way there, resulting in the rest of the ocean being cloaked in complete darkness. So based on the fact that the characters in SpongeBob SquarePants can do things like see each other, not to mention that sometimes the animation also shows sun rays peeking through the water, that would suggest that Squidward and his pals live awfully close to sea level, much like the common octopus. But despite what SB-129 would have you believe, octopi are surprisingly sensitive to extreme cold temperatures. Since the octopus is a cold-blooded animal, its body temperature is determined by its surroundings. This is as opposed to warm-blooded animals like us who just have to maintain the same internal body temperature. So in order to function, most octopi need to live in relatively warm environments, with the common octopus preferring temperatures of about 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Part of why the common octopus lives where it does is because the distribution of heat in the ocean works very much like light. Now that I think about it, the sun is pretty hot. It's almost as if they're actually related. As the light in the ocean fades, so does the heat, and the ocean can get real cold if you travel deep enough. So with that sensitivity to temperature established, what would happen if Squidward found himself in the position of being frozen solid? While the octopus can compensate for chilly conditions in some ways, don't expect Squidward going on any wacky time-traveling romps like he does in the episode anytime soon. As temperature decreases, it becomes much more difficult for cold-blooded animals to do things like live, as their chemical functions all begin to seize up. The lack of heat slows their circulatory system, which means that their blood distributes oxygen to their systems much more slowly, further restricting the abilities of its other vital organs. And we all know how that ends. However, there have been some discoveries that have shown that some species of Antarctic-based octopi have adapted to the cold over the course of the millions of years that separate them from their tropical brethren. And in short, the way they've done this is by reducing the amount of oxygen their proteins and vital organs need in order to continue, living. And this is despite having a very similar genetic makeup to the tropical octopi that prefer much warmer conditions. These cold-dwelling beasts have demonstrated an ability to survive in waters as cold as -2 degrees Celsius, or 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And while that is impressive, it's not exactly the extreme example we're looking for. Many cold-blooded animals are able to function in fluctuating heat conditions. Squidward being frozen solid is a completely different story. And unfortunately, as far as we know, octopi don't possess any sort of cryoprotectant abilities like our previously mentioned wood frogs. So Squidward freezing would actually be pretty similar to any other animal that would freeze to death. When something freezes to death, it's in large part because of its circulatory system completely ceasing its function. This is because blood cells are largely water, and when they're exposed to extreme cold, it can result in ice crystals forming in between the cells, resulting in the dehydration and freezing of the cells, frequently damaging them or destroying the cell membrane completely. This in turn results in a lack of oxygen being delivered to the rest of the creature's systems, which results in the death of all of those cells as well as the creature that's hosting them. And almost nothing we know is safe from this. Not the least of which Squidward, who, since he doesn't seem to be descended from any Antarctica-based octopi, would probably die when exposed to any temperature below freezing for an extended period of time. And when reanimation is attempted, well, you can thaw the body, but those cells aren't gonna regenerate. All in all, based on what we've seen here today, it doesn't look good for Squidward. Based on the biology of octopi, particularly in his own tropical species, Squidward doesn't seem like he'd be able to survive particularly cold temperatures, let alone a freezing one. And we're not even talking about being frozen solid or anything. I'm just talking about like if he lived in Canada. He would be super dead in the winter. Now it's true that we can't discount those Antarctic octopi, but they seem to be the exception more than the rule. I actually came across a fan theory a while ago that suggested that SB-129, particularly its ending, was actually a representation of Squidward's afterlife. It claimed that Squidward was killed during the events of the episode when the time machine he was using malfunctioned and crushed him for the sake of a visual gag. And while I usually don't like to acknowledge they were dead all along theories, I gotta agree with this one. But it wasn't the time machine that killed Squidward, it was the act of freezing himself at all. Philip J. Fry, he is not. With that in mind, I'm going to rate the show's conspiracy of Squidward tentacles surviving 2,000 years after being frozen solid 0.5 jellyfishing nets out of 5. But what do you think? Do you think Squidward could have survived freezing himself? How terrified of the ocean are you after watching this episode? And which character in SpongeBob SquarePants do you relate to the most? I feel like everybody in their life goes through this transition where they go from relating more to SpongeBob to relating more to Squidward. And the more I think about it, I think that transition might just be called adulthood. Be sure to leave us your thoughts in the comments, and also be sure to leave us any conspiracies you'd like us to do an episode on sometime in the future. Until then, be sure to like this video, and if you're new here, subscribe to Channel Frederator. And also, don't forget to ring that little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad and be notified of all sorts of awesome stuff, including more Cartoon Conspiracies. And remember, Frederator loves you. Superheroes are everywhere these days. What with your Marvel Cinematic Universes and your Justice League movies and your Stranger Things, Goonies, or whatever. So it's no surprise that in recent years, Japan has been throwing fuel onto the superhero fire with their own unique takes on the genre, like an anime like One Punch Man and the more recent My Hero Academia. And if you feel so inclined, you should check out our recent 107 Facts video about My Hero Academia over on Cartoon Hangover, cause it's pretty rad. Anyway, today we're going to be taking a look at this high-octane, plus-ultra, most cryingest show ever produced. But really, we're not going to specifically be talking about everybody's favorite half-might hero, Izuku Midoriya. I just wanted to use the word cryingest in this intro. No, instead we're going to be looking at pretty much everybody else in the world of My Hero Academia. And more specifically, the one thing they all have in common. It's true that this show lets us know some really important information about how this universe works and how quirks develop. But some parts of this universe might be worth looking into a bit more. So the question that we're going to be taking a look at today is, does My Hero Academia get human evolution right? Now let's be super clear, I'm not really talking about superpowers, or as they're known in the show, quirks. That's a whole other video. And besides, before we can even talk about the possibility of quirks like being able to create matter, or having earphone jacks, or being a frog, we should first take a look at the base that all of these quirks are built off of. And that base is something that we're told in the very first episode of My Hero Academia. Or Boku no Hero Academia if you're like me and you can't be bothered to wait for dubbed episodes. But for today, we're going to be sticking with the English terminology of the show's dub. And for those of you who haven't seen it, we're not going to be venturing very far into the story, and we're not really going to be venturing past episode 1, so we're going to keep this video pretty spoiler-free. So definitely go check it out once you're done here, because it's actually a really great show. So in the very first episode, we meet everyone's favorite awkward, clumsy, perpetually teary-eyed hero, Izuku Midoriya, also called Deku by his childhood frenemy, Bakugo. Never let me say frenemy ever, unironically again. Very quickly, we learn that Izuku wants nothing more than to be just like his idol, the famous hero and symbol of justice, All Might. Oh, by the way, in this world, most people develop superpowers very early in life, which are known as quirks. That's a pretty important part. Not all of them are created equally, however, and some people just don't develop quirks at all. People like none other than Deku. And the reasoning we're given during his diagnosis as to why he hasn't developed a quirk is both thought-provoking and oddly specific.
People with powers have only one joint in their pinky toes. Their bodies have evolved into a more streamlined version of the human form. You can see here that Izuku has 2 joints in his pinky.
And you know what? That's all well and good. It makes sense to justify why there would be this divide between people who do and people who don't develop quirks within this show's universe. Humanity at that point is just going through a very clear weeding out process, slowly evolving and mutating until those who develop quirks are the only ones to remain. Izuku is probably just a rare case of 2 quirk users giving birth to someone who hasn't developed that mutation. Kind of like if you have brown eyes even though both of your parents have blue eyes. But the entire concept of this divide makes a huge assumption about human evolution as a whole. Along with being the catalyst that eventually led to quirks, this pinky toe mutation seems to be the only thing that separates the characters of My Hero Academia from normal, boring, regular humans like you and me. And Deku. But is this really the case? What is the next step in human evolution? And actually, we're gonna have to stop right here for now because even the word evolution itself has a few different meanings that we should explore. Because evolution today is more than just a scientific discussion. There's also an ongoing philosophical debate about how our own technological advances might fit into our evolutionary timeline. Because while the natural quirks that we see in the show may be nothing but a fantasy, and despite the fact that human evolution so far has taken millions of years, a lot of experts are, in a sense, doing their best to make it happen as soon as possible. We have the technology. This general ideological theme that we're talking about is probably best referred to as transhumanism. The idea that we, as humans, are capable of surpassing just being the meatbags that nature has dictated us to be so far. And this is generally in reference to technological advancements being made in a bunch of different scientific fields. And there is absolutely no end to the amount of cool stuff we could talk about in this episode. But just for the sake of time, let's zero in on one aspect of these advancements, how it can be related to evolution, and how it could serve as a parallel to one of the quirks we've already seen in the show. Consider something as utilitarian as prosthetic limbs. The advancements made in this field are absolutely mind-blowing. About 35 years ago in the early 80s, Canadian hero Terry Fox ran halfway across Canada as part of his Marathon of Hope to raise awareness for cancer research. And he did it all with a prosthetic leg, having lost his original leg to the illness. And looking back, his achievements are only made more amazing when you look at his prosthetic and realize it's not much more than a stick with a shoe at the bottom. Compare this to the tech that we have at our disposal now. And even though those of us who are pushing 30 might feel super old when we realize that we were born closer to the moon landing than today, in the grand scheme of things, 35 years isn't a very long time. Robotics have become much more common moving forward with the technology, especially when it comes to making them more kinetic, adding more moving parts, unlike the mostly passive and rigid prosthetics of old. And some researchers, like MIT's Hugh Herr, are working to make artificial limbs that are functionally indistinguishable from natural ones, even going so far as to create artificial legs that are able to interpret electrical impulses from the muscles of the residual limb and convert these into energy toward limb manipulation. Not to mention, the advent of 3D printing has also made making sockets to fit these prosthetics much more manageable and accessible. And these advancements have also presented problems within athletic competition. Since the introduction of blade prosthetics and legs, certain amputee runners have been denied access to competitions because of the way their prosthetic functions. The curved design of the blades matched with how they absorb shock means that they actually take less energy to operate than normal human legs. So while we might still be a little bit away from having just straight up engines in our legs like THENEW, we might actually be a little bit closer to all of those near future things think pieces than we thought. So does this mean that we should just chop off all of our legs and become superheroes? Well, no. This kind of technology still isn't exactly cheap enough for everyone to utilize. And questions exactly like that one are why there are a lot of people who take ethical umbrage with technological advancements that surpass our own abilities. Also, please don't cut your legs off. Channel Frederator does not endorse you chopping off any of your limbs unless you're a necromorph. But you're probably not one. So we've gotten a little carried away, haven't we? While the advancements in prosthetics are amazing, there are so many more enhancements that fit under the transhumanist umbrella that we could mention. All that stuff we just talked about is just the beginning of the tip of the iceberg. But even so, this isn't exactly the same as the natural pinky toe evolution presented in My Hero Academia, which is apparently helpful in determining if you'll develop a quirk. So let's shift gears here and see what the word is on the next natural unassisted evolution in humans and what that could entail. One of the pitfalls in how we think is that we often think that we've reached our final form. This is it. This is the final stop. This is where the bus gets off the train. No, I don't want to do a second take. But practically speaking, we probably never will. Just as the cells that constitute you are constantly being replaced, humanity is in a constant state of flux, always changing and developing. Heck, if you want proof of this, look no further than your wisdom teeth. A prevailing theory is that they were useful once upon a time, but as our jawline changed, they just became these things that made everybody uncomfortable and were best left to just be yanked out of your head. But what does this have to do with Midoriya's pinky toe? Well, it means that there's a bunch of different guesses as to what's next for human evolution. Ever since this guy, Charles Darwin, sauntered onto the scientific scene in the 19th century, the process of evolution has been viewed through the lens of natural selection. The idea that certain beneficial traits in species are more likely to survive because of their usefulness. And a common illustration of this thinking involves giraffes of all things. Say there's an area that's plagued with a food shortage for insert a ridiculously long amount of time here. And the only way for herbivores to get food is by grazing the tall trees of the land. The quadrupeds with the longer necks and longer reach would be more likely to get food than their short-necked brethren. On top of the long neck having an increased chance of survival, since the short necks are likely to die sooner, the long necks will also have a better chance of reproducing sexually, creating more long necks in the process. Eventually, the short necks will have been naturally cut out of the gene pool and the long-necked trait will become the standard. Of course, this is oversimplified, but this is the basic idea. So what traits could we humans be unknowingly selecting? Actually, better idea, let's start with the validity of our main focus, Izuku's problem of missing one of 3 joints in his toe. Yes, you heard right, he's actually missing one. This is because the good doctor's explanation in the show is a little different than what we're familiar with. See, the bones that make up our toes are called phalangeal bones, and most toes have 3 of them, called the proximal, the medial, and the distal phalanges. But this joint at the bottom of the proximal phalange that connects to this bone, the metatarsal bone, also counts as a joint for your toe. And I assume that this is because without it, your toe wouldn't be connected to your foot. With this in mind, you can see that most toes have 3 phalangeal joints. They're triphalangeal, not biphalangeal as our doctor suggests. The only toe without this quality would be your big toe, which, much like your thumb, is probably biphalangeal. And this actually raises an interesting point. Here's a normal X-ray of a human's big toe. Now, here's Izuku's.
Something's wrong with the left phalange.
Not only is he missing one of the phalanges in his pinky toe, but he's also got 3 phalangeal joints in his big toe. What could this mean? Is it a rare deformity? Is he a mutant? Is he even human? Any and all of these guesses could be correct. But since the doctor doesn't make a big deal out of this, it would seem that the humans in My Hero Academia are a little different than the humans that we know ourselves to be. But I don't mean different as in having 2 joints in your pinky toe. In fact, some people are already known to have a biphalangeal 5th toe, as opposed to triphalangeal. According to a 2014 study published by UK-based scientific journal Biomed Central Musculoskeletal Disorders, having only 2 joints in your 5th toe is way more common than you think. Of the roughly 2,500 feet they examined, it was almost a 50-50 split, with 46.3% of toes having only 2 joints. Having only 1 joint on your 5th toe, on the other hand, on the other foot. Idioms are hard when I'm talking about body parts. Let's just do it again. The pinky toe only possessing 1 joint, like most of the heroes in My Hero Academia apparently have, is way less common. But many people claim that the pinky toe is pretty much useless to humans, so could a more streamlined foot be the next step in human evolution? Well, keep in mind that natural selection doesn't really actively wipe out useless traits. It only favors beneficial traits and then settles for whatever's good enough to survive. So it looks like our pinky toes, in both body bi and triphalangeal forms could be here to stay. Unless these joints started to just actively become detrimental to our survival, like if you stubbed your pinky toe, you just died. Although to be fair, it does pretty much just feel like that anyway. Now then, this does raise the question of what caused the characters of this show to have to evolve to having this more streamlined, one-jointed, pinky-toed foot, but that might be a topic for another time. But to wrap up, let's take a look at some of the other guesses as to where human evolution could possibly be headed. As it turns out, there's actually very little consensus on what the next step could be, or if there even is a next step. Some experts believe that the only way that humans will continue to evolve is through transhumanist means, like by way of increased prosthetic functionality, or gene manipulation, or computerized implants to combat things like hearing loss or Parkinson's. Basically, the hypothesis here is that we're all going to become cyborgs. And because of humanity's vast cultural differences and just how far across the world we've all spread out, barring some sort of unforeseen event that somehow wouldn't cause all of us to go extinct, there probably won't be any more drastic natural changes to our evolution. Meanwhile, others have proposed that while it seems like human evolution may have started to slow down, it's still definitely working. Though it's pretty much impossible to predict, as natural selection has a tendency to be a wee bit unexpected. This whole topic is way more open-ended than one might think. And if you think that the idea that we might be just done is short-sighted, well, you might be right. And there have been some actual guesses as to what could happen, like women evolving to experiencing menopause later in life to everyone evolving to be taller. But conclusions like this one, of course, are problematic, as a lot of them infer things based on other studies that were only focused on a very small group of people that also make the assumption that nothing about these people or these areas are going to change across generations, even though there's a whole host of variables that could change. So there isn't really anything conclusive to draw from these guesses as it applies to large sweeping evolutionary changes around the world. To have any firm hypothesis about the future of human evolution would be to predict the future with very little knowledge. Basically, you're trying to guess the winning lottery numbers, but you know for sure that there probably won't be any letters in the combination. And this is pretty much what My Hero Academia's take on evolution is. It's not really a prophetic look into what could be next, it's just a guess. And I'm not faulting the manga or the show for this. Even if we think that natural selection will leave the pinky toe just as it is, we can't be 100% sure that we're correct. So with all of this discussion on prosthetics, transhumanism, and the kinda sorta hypotheses on the road that human evolution could be going down on the plausibility meter, I'm going to have to rate My Hero Academia's assumptions on human evolution 2 UA staff members out of 5. But what do you think? What do you think the next steps in human evolution could be? Why do you think Suyu Asui is the best character in My Hero Academia? And finally, the million-dollar question. Keeping in mind that this show seems to have a negative for every positive in their quirks, what do you think your quirk would be? Be sure to leave us your thoughts in the comments below, and also be sure to send us any ideas for conspiracies you'd like us to take a look at in a later episode. And if you'd like to see more content focused around anime, you should check out our sister channel, Cartoon Hangover, where we post 107 facts videos about anime every month. Until then, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Channel Frederator, and click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad. And remember, Frederator loves you. Not sure if you've noticed, but Disney's been on a little bit of a reboot kick with their stuff lately. You know, remakes of movies like Cinderella, Jungle Book, Beauty and the Beast, planned remakes for movies like Aladdin and Mulan. But that's all big picture Hollywood stuff. I think it's about time that Disney reboot one of their animated TV shows. Ideally, one where life is like a hurricane and has plenty of tales of daring, do bad and good luck tales. Woohoo. Ever since the announcement of the DuckTales reboot, people have been asking tons of questions. Questions like, will Donald join the gang this time? Who's going to play Scrooge McDuck? And most importantly, did they keep the theme song? And amazingly, the answer to all of those questions is yes, except the second one, the answer to that one is David Tennant, which is even more amazing. But there is one question that's been lingering in the backs of our minds for years now, and it's one that's never really been addressed, even though family is a pretty important component to DuckTales. And that question is, what's the deal with Huey, Dewey, and Louie's father? Alright, I'm gonna be real with you right off the bat and say that this is a tricky one. There aren't exactly a whole lot of duck suspects that we can go through that haven't already been proven as not the father. So instead of going through them one by one, let's instead frame this episode by asking, is Huey, Dewey, and Louie's father still in their lives without their knowledge? Cool? Cool. Oh, and by the way, we're gonna need to come up with some verbal shorthand for Huey, Dewey, and Louie, or I'm going to go insane in this episode. So from now on, let's call them the Quack Pack. Yes, like that TV show from 1996 that nobody remembers. Also, do not take a drink every time I say Quack Pack in this episode, you will die. And finally, when it comes to the new series, it looks like this show is going to be picking and choosing elements from the previously established universe and go forward like that. Some things from the 80s and 90s cartoon will stay the same, some things will take after the comics. Basically, they're changing a whole bunch of stuff, except Launchpad. Launchpad is pretty much the same. But today, with regards to the new show, we're going to discount any sort of major revelation about this mystery that might be dropped in the near future. So, with all of this in mind, let's take a look at the incredibly extensive Duck family tree. Since the character at the center of this whole universe is essentially Donald Duck, and since Donald Duck has been around like forever, there are a lot of conflicting reports about the Duck family tree, and I'm gonna write that in my journal of sentences I never thought I was going to say in my life. But this is because over the years, many different writers and illustrators have attempted to chart this family tree. And this family can get pretty sprawling. It's kind of like looking at a family tree from Game of Thrones. But the genealogy that is most generally accepted as canon is the one depicted here by comic artist Don Rosa. For reference, Rosa is a comic artist who wrote about 90 stories from 1987 to 2006 centered around the characters of the Disney Duck universe. And incidentally, Rosa picked up this mantle from Carl Barks, who wrote and illustrated the Donald Duck cartoons and created most of the characters that we know and love today, including Scrooge McDuck. So coming from Rosa, who wrote with the utmost respect to the world that Barks established, this family tree seems like the most canon representation that we're going to get. And just looking at this tree, there are a couple of things worth taking note of. Obviously, the most prominent thing is that the Quack Pack's father is conveniently obscured by a passing bird because it's a tree, because jokes, and that is so frustrating. But yes, he's there, he has the last name Duck, and that's literally all of the information we have based on this tree. That is to say, information that's directly related to the father. Next, we can see that the Quack Pack calling Donald Uncle Donald isn't just some cute pet name, he actually literally is their uncle. Furthermore, the mother of the Quack Pack can be established as Donald's sister, Della, both of whom are the nephew and niece of Scrooge McDuck, respectively. Now, in the history of the comics and animations, there has been some confusion as to whether Della is actually Donald's sister or whether her name actually is Della. But over the years, these inconsistencies have been hammered out, and the generally accepted canon now is that Della is Donald's sister and that she is indeed the biological mother of the Quack Pack. Also, slight spoilers, but it looks like the new show may be exploring the character of the Quack Pack's mother in greater detail, but let's not get too caught up in that. And since this is a Disney property, a very popular theory about the Quack Pack's parentage is that their father has died. And the primary piece of evidence for this first appeared when our three heroes were first introduced to the Donald Duck comics in 1937, when Della left the three in his care. The note that Della left read, "Dear Donald, I am sending your angel nephews Louie, Huey, and Dewey to stay with you while their father is in the hospital. A giant firecracker exploded under his chair. The little darlings are so playful, I hope you enjoy them. Your cousin, Della." By the way, this is one of those inconsistencies that got ironed out later. Anyway, so the theory states that their father probably died in the hospital. But that's a bit of a stretch, especially since it doesn't explain why the Quack Pack would remain in Donald's care if Della was still around. So what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned that the Quack Pack's father is a duck, who probably isn't Donald, because if it were, we would be venturing into some real Game of Thrones territory. And the only other thing we know is that he was injured once upon a time. Now, that's not much, but is there anything else we can learn from the Duck family tree? So here's an interesting thing about the Don Rosa family tree. There's actually another version of it. If it looks incredibly similar, it's because it's mostly just a redrawn version of the official one for his personal use. The most notable difference, however, is that the Quack Pack's father isn't being obscured by an inconsiderate bird. And the design is actually incredibly similar to another depiction of the Quack Pack's father, in this earlier unofficial tree drawn by Mark Warden. And while it could mean something, this early family tree also depicts some of the previously mentioned inconsistencies, like Donald's sister being named Thelma instead of Della. So while it is difficult to treat anything with regards to the Quack Pack's father as canon, this seems like the closest we're going to get to an official visual representation of their father. And surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, depending on how you like your theories, he bears very little resemblance to any of the main characters that we've become accustomed to. Aw shucks, there goes our twist ending. And one last note on this, apparently Rosa used to give copies of this tree out to his fans, in which he would would write the fan's name in the blank space in which the Quack Pack's father's name should be. So the father's name is unfortunately still a mystery, other than the last name Duck, which is on the other Rosa family tree. Side note, I just realized that the Quack Pack's father probably took Della's last name in their marriage, since he, his wife, and his brother-in-law all share the same last name. There's a non-traditional fun fact for you. Alright, we're getting a little caught up in Duck family politics, another sentence I never thought I was going to say in my life. So let's take a step back and look at something a little more straightforward that may not have been taken into consideration when making these comics or this crazy action-adventure series, but it's still fun to look at nonetheless. Considering all of these characters are ducks, how do actual duck family dynamics work? Well, turns out that most breeds of wild duck actually maintain monogamous relationships, but these rarely last longer than a year. Kinda like most millennial marriages. In the case of wild ducks, the mother is generally more protective and caring for her ducklings, but they will abandon them if necessary due to things like illness or uncontrollable circumstances. And just like a certain duck family that we've come to know, the father would have long fled the nest. So there actually is a precedent for the Quack Pack's father to not be in the picture. That reasoning doesn't really explain every other male in the family tree, though. Or why Della appears to have abandoned her children despite an apparent lack of illnesses from them or anything like that. What might, though, is that it's worth mentioning that the white feathers and orange bills these characters possess mean that they're most likely a breed of duck known as the Peking duck, which is a domestic breed of duck derived from the common mallard. And originally they were brought to America from China in the late 1800s. And domestic breeds of duck like this are much more likely to be more neglectful of their eggs or their ducklings, which also suggests that the Quack Pack's father or mother could have left them behind. And the Peking duck is probably the most common form of domesticated duck in America, primarily because they... this has some dark implications. So in the US, about half of all ducks that are raised to be slaughtered are Peking ducks, which are used almost exclusively for meat. You know, to be eaten. So while it's unpleasant, if we approach this from a real-world perspective, it's looking like the Quack Pack's father is most definitely dead. Possibly eaten. Because this is Disney, and dark theories are somehow inescapable when talking about Walt's Happy Time Whimsical Bounce Mouse House. But that's all dumb old meat space real life, who cares about that? And you know what? You're right. Let's finish this off by taking a look at the parents are dead theory strictly through the universe of the comics and the cartoons. It's a common theory that pops up in pretty much everything, but let's see if there's actually any merit to it here. Firstly, and pretty damningly, Scrooge frequently refers to Donald as his closest living relative. And if Donald and his sister are of equal familial standing to Scrooge, then that doesn't really reassure us about Della's health. And actually, we can take this line of thinking a step further. In the comic series Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, written by Don Rosa, Scrooge meets his nephew and his grandnephews, very quickly telling them, "I'm not used to relatives either. The few I have seem to have disappeared." He says it just like that, but like, you know, more Scottish. To which Huey, Dewey, and Louie respond, "We know how that feels, Uncle Scrooge." Now, Scrooge may have initially been portrayed as cantankerous and uncaring, kinda like his namesake, so it might be fair to assume that Scrooge means that people have given up on him. But that doesn't really explain his grandnephew's reaction, nor does it really factor in that Scrooge is a pretty good guy at heart. So this quote, paired with all of this other evidence, only makes it look worse for the Quack Pack's dad. After all, if Della is dead, then fine, whatever. But then why are Donald and Scrooge caring for the Quack Pack instead of their father? It's not like a firecracker exploding under your chair is gonna sideline you forever. And finally, and most convincingly, it's shown in the 1942 cartoon, The New Spirit, that Donald officially adopted Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And it doesn't get much more official than Donald stating it right on his US income tax. I mean, yeah, Donald could have been lying, but since this short was commissioned by the US Treasury Department to educate people about how their tax dollars were going toward the war effort, I don't think this short would be promoting tax fraud, even if it is the American way. Wait, hang on, do government-assigned shorts count as canon? Judges say yes. So with all of that in mind, why would Donald officially adopt the Quack Pack unless their parents were completely out of the picture? More specifically, dead. I mean, yes, there are theories that suggest that the Quack Pack's parents actually faked their deaths or that they were deemed super neglectful, but there's way less direct evidence to prove that. Basically, all of the evidence in existence is that letter that Della left Donald in 1937. So if we're talking in-universe, in true Disney fashion, dead parents seems to make the most sense. So with everything we've taken a look at today, while we have been able to clear up some of the ambiguity about the duck family tree, we haven't really been able to come to a definite conclusion about the identity of the Quack Pack's father. But based on our discoveries about the family dynamics of actual ducks, as well as the family dynamics of the Donald/Scrooge McDuck family, either way, the evidence seems to point towards the father of the Quack Pack being not only a character we've never met, but also dead. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to have to rate the plausibility of Huey, Dewey, and Louie's father still being in their lives without their knowledge 1 number 1 dime out of 5. And he was possibly eaten. But what do you think? Do you have any theories towards the identity of Huey, Dewey, and Louie's father? Are you excited for the new DuckTales series? And also, who is your absolute favorite character in the expanded Disney Duck universe, and why is it Darkwing Duck? Be sure to leave us your thoughts in the comments, and also be sure to leave us any conspiracies you'd like to see us tackle in the future. Until then, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Channel Frederator, and click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad. And remember, Frederator loves you. I don't need to reintroduce Rick and Morty, right? Adult Swim show created by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland, crazy interdimensional travels. We're all on the same page here, right? So as you may recall, we've taken a look at a handful of theories that cover the spectrum of just how chaotic this show can be. But among all of them, there is one theory that's worth revisiting with the upcoming season. And that's concerning the identity of the evil Morty in close Rick counters of the Rick kind. He was quite the departure from the general idea of Morty that we've come to accept. But other than a Morty, obviously, who is this? What could his intentions be? And most importantly, will he finally make his return in season 3? So because this is Rick and Morty and because a lot of details can get lost in the shuffle, let's approach this pragmatically and first establish everything that we know. And let's start with what we can infer from the one, the only, evil Morty. Or Eye Patch Morty, as some people call him for, I don't know, some stupid reason. It's in Close Rick Counters where it's revealed that evil Morty was actually remotely controlling evil Rick, so we can pretty much discount evil Rick entirely and attribute all of his words and actions to evil Morty. However, we can also be pretty confident in saying that evil Morty and evil Rick probably don't share any other connection. You know, like evil Morty being evil Rick's Morty. How can we be so sure? There are a couple of reasons, but most prevalent is that evil Morty appeared to view evil Rick as just means to an end. Also, because of the blending in with the Rickless Mortys, we can be confident in saying that evil Morty is a Rickless Morty and has been one for quite some time. Since Mortys are a virtually infinite resource to Ricks, there isn't really any reason for most Ricks to pursue a Morty for too long before giving up and reapplying for a new Morty to be assigned to them. But notice how I said most Ricks? Well, that's because there's at least one Rick that may care more about Morty than he actually lets on. And that's our hero, good ol' Rick from Dimension C-137. On second thought, good ol' is really not the descriptor I should be using for him. So we know that C-137 Rick cares a mite more about his Morty than a lot of other Ricks do, since he tears up at viewing memories of Morty in Close Rick Counters. But he also seems to be the Rick who is the most uncompromising in his beliefs when compared to all of the Ricks in the Central Finite Curve, with his tenuous relationship with the Council of Ricks being the primary source for that claim. Insert clip of the Council of Ricks being destroyed by C-137 Rick here. But even at the end of Close Rick Counters, Rick doesn't grant Morty any sort of positive reinforcement as he doesn't believe Morty will gain anything from it, further illustrating just how set in his ways that Rick is, whether others like it or not. So with that preliminary information in mind, we're next going to establish what I'm going to call the Rick and Morty Relative Alignment Spectrum, or RAMRAS for short. Although we're probably never going to call it that. We'll be referring to this chart throughout this video to hopefully give us a bit of insight on the nature of different iterations of Rick and Morty. As revealed once again in Close Rick Counters, Ricks use Mortys as camouflage. This is because their brainwave patterns perfectly cancel each other out, effectively making them diametrically opposed foes. And based on Rick and Morty's conversations in Close Rick Counters, their two respective defining character traits seem to be related to intelligence and empathy. We can relatively easily place most incarnations of Rick and Morty on a four-way spectrum consisting of these two axes. On the x-axis, we have a spectrum ranging from Rick's superintelligence to Morty's Morty brainwaves, while on the y-axis, we have Morty's empathy at the top and Rick's cold, uncompromising outlook at the bottom. Obviously, given the infinite possibilities of Rick and Morty, a study of a couple dozen Ricks and Mortys would probably result in a scatter plot that looks something like this. But there are a few extremes that may be important to figuring out who exactly evil Morty could be. Firstly, in the bottom right, the most uncompromising and the most intelligent, the Rickest Rick, is arguably our good friend C-137 Rick. If for no other reason than he self-identified himself as the Rickest Rick in Rick Counters. Perfect. And just as Rick says, it should go without saying that the Rickest Rick should have the Mortiest Morty. So we can place the Morty we follow through most of the show at the opposite extreme, possessing the standard Morty waves as well as displaying the most empathy of all Mortys. And just to quickly fill out the other extremes, the oddest Rick out that we've met so far would obviously be the Rick from universe J19 Zeta 7, who we'll from now on just refer to as Doofus Rick. After all, he's a total outcast from all of the other Ricks for seemingly no other reason than he's just more empathetic to other people, especially Jerry, which, like, why? No wonder he's weird. But since Doofus Rick appears to oddly still be a genius capable of interdimensional travel, he's still intelligent, which would comfortably place him in the top right corner, earning the title of the Mortiest Rick. As for our missing corner here, seems like a cold, uncompromising Morty who still possessed a Morty brainwave pattern would fit comfortably there. So are we good to assume that evil Morty is in fact the Rickest Morty? And before we go any further, yes, I'm aware of how problematic this chart can be for a show whose core concept is about infinite parallel universes. But the show doesn't seem to concern itself much with this problem, so we won't either. Yes, there are practically infinite Ricks, but for all intents and purposes, there has to be a limit. After all, we still don't even know what the limitations of the central finite curve even are, so there's no sense dwelling on it. Okay, with all of this preliminary stuff taken care of, let's get to some theories about Evil Morty. 3 of them to be exact. And from there, we might be able to determine if Evil Morty is poised to come back in Season 3. Okay, we're a bit all over the place right now, but before we dive any deeper, it's important to keep in mind that taking literally anything in Rick and Morty at face value is kind of an exercise in futility. So all we can really do is speculate. Alright, now with that in mind, let's get rolling. First up, one theory that surfaced is that Evil Morty could actually be Doofus Rick's Morty. Given how completely opposite they are to both each other, as well as our general perception of Rick and Morty, this seems like a pretty good idea. And that's not even factoring in that both characters were introduced in the same episode. And if we refer to the Ramraz, oh my god, we actually used the name. Seems like Evil Morty and Doofus Rick would cancel each other out and fill out the main 4 corners of our spectrum, so slam dunk, right? Well, no. It never is, you should know this by now. The massive problem with this is that Doofus Rick mentions to Jerry that he never had any kids. And to counter this, some fans have theorized that just as Doofus Rick is a Rick without a Morty, maybe Evil Morty is a Morty without a Rick. But that's more difficult to justify because that's not how time or genetics works. Not every Rick needs a Morty, but every Morty would probably need a Rick. I mean, unless they were a clone, in which case this theory could still work, but that's a whole other can of worms that we honestly don't have time for today. Another idea concerning Doofus Rick is that maybe he and Evil Morty were originally a normal Rick and Morty who had their consciousness swapped for some unspecified reason, most likely to hide Rick from the Council of Ricks. After all, what better Morty camouflage is there other than actually being a Morty? And as of the Rickshank Rickdemption, we know that this technology exists and can be used without any ill effects. So it's definitely an interesting idea. However, it doesn't quite explain a lot of things. Like why Evil Morty feels that he needs to kill other Ricks to gain power. Or why Doofus Rick, if he's a Morty in the body of a Rick, would decide to continue this act long after he was abandoned by Evil Morty. And that's under very little scrutiny. Given more time, there's probably a lot more threads that don't quite add up. Next up, we have the theory that regardless of who Evil Morty is, he set off on a Rick-killing rampage in order to free other Mortys of the oppression that they endure. And honestly, regardless of who Evil Morty is, that's not the craziest idea. For the purposes of this theory, it doesn't really matter who Evil Morty originally belonged to, but regardless, it would serve to make any other theory about Evil Morty way more interesting. Also, funnily enough, Evil Morty would essentially be setting himself up as the savior of the Church of the Good Morty, being the one Morty to rise up and deliver all Mortys from their oppressors. If he were to lead a revolution against the Ricks, it would stand to reason that all followers of the religion would rally behind him. Look at how quickly they stood behind the Morty we follow throughout the show in close Rick counters. However, if this were the case, Evil Morty doesn't seem to have any problem oppressing other Mortys as long as it's for his benefit. Case in point, the protective wall of Mortys. Granted, puppeteering a Rick throughout Rick counters would require him to employ some diabolical Rick-like tactics, but it's still a point worth mentioning. Though it can be easily waved away by, well, you know, he was undercover. You can't make a God-complex omelet without breaking a few Mortys. I just realized I was super mocking there, but you could actually wave wave all of that away with that exact logic. But finally, we're going to examine one more theory which has a bit more for us to bite into. And this is that evil Morty is actually C-137 Rick's original Morty. But notice how I'm not saying that he's Morty C-137? This is because Rick's original Morty is not C-137 Morty. By the way, if this theory sounds familiar, it's because we've briefly looked at it before in an earlier Cartoon Conspiracy. But there are some additional details that make this theory a bit meatier that we're going to take a look at right now. We never hear our Morty mention anything about originating from a dimension that was anything other than the now Cronenberged C-137. And usurping the positions of the Rick and Morty of the dimension that they currently occupy was pretty scarring to him. So seeing as these all seem to be new experiences for him, this would make our Morty unquestionably C-137 Morty. As we know, since Beth has mentioned it no less than 400 times, Rick left her family quite some time ago before recently coming back. Most fans have come to accept that Rick was gone for about 20 years, but it's never specifically stated in the show. Though we can definitely assume that it's longer than Morty has been alive. So we have all of this time in Rick's life that's just unaccounted for. So, and here's the million-dollar question, what was he doing? Actually, let's answer that question with another question. How did evil Morty get to be so intelligent? 99.9% of all other Mortys his age are of about the same intelligence. That is to say, nowhere near Rick's ability. But evil Morty is consistently way more clever than normal. And how else could this be accomplished unless he, at one point, spent an inordinate amount of time with a Rick who taught him from a very young age? And I forget, which Rick has very vivid memories of a young Morty again? Oh, that's right, C-137 Rick. Not to mention the photo of Rick holding a baby Morty in Bird Person's home. So let's entertain this thought just a little bit longer. Let's assume that C-137 Rick actually raised his original Morty but then screwed the kid up, causing him to then return to Dimension C-137 to raise his original Morty? Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, C-137 Rick isn't actually from Dimension C-137. By turning our thinking around, may I present to you the best possible— no, I immediately retract that. I don't want that kind of pressure. A possible explanation for the origins of evil Morty, meticulously crafted from some evidence, assumption, and a lot of speculation. In an unknown dimension, Dimension X, our Rick, C-137 Rick, raises his original Morty to be just like himself, but goes a little too far. Over the course of several years, this young Morty is slowly corrupted and eventually desensitized to all aspects of interdimensional travel, including the disposability of Mortys themselves. This, combined with the intelligence gained, displaces this Morty from the natural order and makes him essentially equal with our Rick, and that's a situation which obviously won't end well. This Morty, now evil Morty, inevitably turns on Rick, which results in the two parting ways under less than amicable terms. Rick flees to a dimension in which Beth's father left and died, or left and never returned, to assume the role of that universe's Rick to try all over again with a fresh new Morty. And this dimension is Dimension C-137. C-137 could be a dimension in which the original C-137 Rick had already died, leaving our Rick to take his place, like in Rick Potion number 9. Based on his actions in that episode, it seems like he's done this before. This would explain why Rick still pushes Morty to chase scientific pursuits. Rick may have screwed up with his original Morty, but he uses these mistakes to teach a new Morty more responsibly. Slightly more responsibly. It also explains a couple of other niggling questions, like why exactly evil Morty would go after C-137 Rick in the first place. I know he says it's because of his evil factor in his evil database so that he can kill him and then gain his knowledge, but honestly, just vengeance for his mistreatment of his original Morty is more than an acceptable motive. After all, we do see a memory of a Morty being electrified who could very well be Rick's original Morty, so it's not like C-137 Rick's hands are clean, really. It would also explain Rick's welling up when he sees his memories of baby Morty. Rick's not one to admit his regrets easily, but this would definitely be something he could feel genuine remorse for. And finally, the biggest piece of evidence that links C-137 Rick to evil Morty is the exchange held at the end of Rick Counters. Rick tells Morty not to let anything get to his head, because a Morty that gets too cocky can cause problems and be a real bad thing for everybody. On top of Rick sounding like he was speaking from experience, he also tells Morty that he'll explain explain more when he's older. From there, the episode cuts to literally what evil Morty was doing. Basic film language would dictate that ending a scene on an unanswered question and then cutting to a seemingly unrelated scene would denote meaning between the two. A cut like that generally foreshadows or implies a connection between the two events. Granted, with Harmon and Roiland at the helm here, they could be intentionally burying the lead because that's what they do, but traditional conventions do support C-137 Rick and Evil Morty having a strong connection. Based on the evidence we've seen, it looks like Evil Morty being C-137 Rick's original Morty would be the most likely and most dramatic answer to who exactly Evil Morty is. As for whether he'll return in Season 3, with just how much from the past was called back to in the first episode of Season 3, like Phoenix Person and the Cronenberg universe, it looks like Season 3 will largely be a season for revisiting unresolved plot threads. And Evil Morty is one of the biggest, so I would rate the plausibility of Evil Morty revealing himself to be C-137 Rick's original Morty and returning this season 3.5 vouchers for a free replacement Morty out of 5. But this is Rick and Morty, and everybody and their mom has theories about it. So let's open up the floor. What do you think? Who do you think Evil Morty / Eye Patch Morty really is? Do you think he's going to show up in Season 3, or do you think that plot thread's just going to be left dangling, just tantalizing us with possibilities? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments, and also be sure to let us know if you have any theories you'd like us to take a look at in a later episode. And also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Channel Frederator if you're new here. And also, you should probably click that little bell icon next to the subscribe button so you can join our awesome notification squad. And remember, Frederator loves you. Enjoy Season 3 of Rick and Morty, because we're all going to be doing that too. And as is tradition after covering this show, I'm gonna go lie down.
Thank you for watching a few of our best conspiracies. Were there any conspiracies that you think should have made the list? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to become part of our notification squad. And remember, Frederator loves you.